He spent 6 years building an empire on blood, fear, and the crushed bones of every man who dared stand in his way. Then one Tuesday morning, a plain white envelope destroyed everything he thought he owned. Not with a bullet, not with a betrayal, but with a photograph of a little boy who had his eyes. Dante Moretti had ordered executions without blinking, had rebuilt entire criminal networks from ash, had made senators beg and rival bosses weep, but right now, sitting alone in a penthouse worth $40 million, his hands were shaking over a photograph of a 6-year-old child he never knew existed. This is the story of the most feared man in the country, and the one thing that finally broke him. If this hits you, drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because this one doesn't let go. The divorce papers had been Dante's idea. He remembered the morning clearly. The way the light came through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the conference room on the 42nd floor. The way his attorney had stacked the documents in a neat, apologetic pile. The way Elena had sat across from him in a gray dress that made her look smaller than she actually was. She hadn't cried. That had surprised him. He'd expected tears, maybe accusations, maybe the kind of operatic grief that women in his world performed when they sensed they were losing leverage. Instead, she had looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, eyes that had always made him feel uncomfortably, like she could see through the armor, and she had picked up the pen without a word. She signed every page. Dante had watched her hand move across the paper and felt something he refused to name. Relief, he'd told himself. It was relief. He was untangling himself from the one vulnerability he couldn't afford. Marriage was exposure. Elena was exposure. In the world he operated in, love was not a sanctuary. It was a target painted on your chest for every enemy who wanted leverage. His attorney had cleared his throat. Elena had capped the pen, set it on the table with a soft click, and stood. "That's everything," she said. "Not I hate you, not I hope you rot, just that's everything." Like she was finishing a grocery list. Dante had nodded. He had been so certain in that moment that he was making the right call. That clarity, that cold executive certainty, was the thing he prided himself on above all else. No sentiment, no hesitation, just the correct decision, made at the correct time, executed cleanly. What he didn't know, sitting in that conference room with the afternoon light cutting clean lines across the table, was that Elena was already 6 weeks pregnant. She didn't tell him. She didn't tell him because she had spent 3 years watching him choose the empire over everything else, every single time, without exception, without apology. She'd watched him leave their bed at 2 in the morning to take calls he'd never explain. She'd watched him look through her at dinner like she was a piece of furniture he'd forgotten to return. She'd watched him shake hands with men she knew were monsters and come home smelling like cigarettes and other people's fear. And somewhere in those 3 years she had understood, not with bitterness, but with the kind of exhausted clarity that comes after you've cried yourself empty enough times, that telling him would not bring him back to her. It would only chain him to her, and a chained Dante Moretti was a dangerous thing to be near. So she signed the papers, capped the pen, and walked out of that conference room carrying a secret that would reshape both their lives 6 years later. Dante built the empire the way he did everything, with absolute focus and no concern for collateral damage. The Moretti Syndicate had existed for 3 generations, but it had never looked like this. His grandfather had run numbers and loan sharking out of the back rooms of Italian restaurants. His father had graduated to construction contracts, union corruption, and the occasional body in a river. But Dante had vision. He saw that the old model was dying, that the FBI was getting better, that visibility was the enemy. He restructured everything, pushed the money through legitimate real estate holdings, through tech investment shells, through a foundation that donated to children's hospitals, and put Dante's name on plaques in hospital lobbies. He hired attorneys who'd clerked for federal judges. He cultivated relationships with 3 city councilmen, 2 state senators, and a deputy director of a federal agency whose name he'd never say out loud in a room with cameras. By year 3 after the divorce, the Moretti organization was the most insulated criminal enterprise on the eastern seaboard. By year 5, Dante was personally worth somewhere north of $200 million, though the exact number existed only in offshore accounts that would take a decade to untangle. He lived in a penthouse with a private elevator. He had a chef, a driver, 2 bodyguards who rotated in 12-hour shifts, and a rotating cast of women who wanted things from him that he was happy to provide because they required nothing emotional in return. His captains feared him. His rivals respected him in the way you respect a loaded gun, carefully, from a distance, with both hands visible. He was, by every measurable standard, winning. And yet, there were mornings, not often, but they came, when he'd stand at the window with his coffee going cold in his hand and look out at the city he'd spent years learning to control and feel absolutely nothing. Not satisfaction, not pride, just a flat gray nothing, like looking at a painting in a language you don't speak. He dismissed the feeling quickly, efficiently, the way he dismissed anything that threatened his operational clarity. He'd take a meeting, make a decision, sign something. The nothing would recede, but it always came back. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. No return address, postmarked from a small city 400 miles away. His head of security had flagged it as a potential threat. Anything anonymous that reached Dante's personal address went through a sweep first, but the sweep found nothing dangerous. Just paper. Just an envelope with his name written in handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it alone, in his office, after his 10 o'clock meeting had cleared out. Inside was a photograph, printed on standard photo paper, the kind you get at a drugstore. A little boy, maybe 5 or 6, standing in what looked like a public park. He was laughing at something off camera, his head thrown back, and the afternoon light caught him in a way that made the image look almost cinematic. He was wearing a blue jacket and had a smudge of what might have been ice cream on his chin. And he had Dante's eyes. Not similar to Dante's eyes. Not reminiscent of. Dante's eyes. The exact shape, the exact dark intensity, the precise heaviness of the brow that Dante had seen in every mirror for 41 years. His hands had gone still. Behind the photograph was a single page, handwritten, in Elena's measured script. He recognized her handwriting before he registered the words. Dante. His name is Nico. He is 6 years old. He is healthy and happy, and he asks about his father sometimes, and I have run out of answers that don't hurt him. I am not writing this to punish you or to want anything from you. I am writing this because he deserves to know you exist, and because I hope, that somewhere inside the man you've become, you still have the capacity to be something more than what you've chosen to be. If you want to meet him, I will arrange it. If you don't, I will understand and I will never contact you again. The choice, as always, is yours. E. Dante read the letter 3 times. Then he sat down, just dropped into his chair like the muscles in his legs had suddenly forgotten their job, and stared at the photograph for a long time. The boy's laugh, the smudge of ice cream, the eyes, his eyes. He thought about Elena in that gray dress, capping the pen with that soft click. He thought about 3 years of dinners he'd eaten without tasting. He thought about the thing he'd felt when she walked out of the conference room, the thing he'd called relief, and understood, sitting here now with his hands still and the photograph blurring slightly because his vision was doing something embarrassing. That relief had never been the right word. The right word was loss. He'd just been too stubborn and too stupid to recognize it at the time. He didn't call his attorney. He didn't call his head of security. He didn't run a background check on the postmark or have the letter analyzed for psychological profiling, which was something he would absolutely have done in any other circumstance. He called Elena's number from memory. It had never left him, which was its own kind of confession, and she answered on the 3rd ring. I got the envelope, he said. A pause. I know. Why now? Another pause, longer. Because he started asking questions I can't keep deflecting. He's smart, Dante. He's very, very smart. And he's going to figure out that I've been protecting him from something. I'd rather he hear the truth from you than construct his own version of it. Dante looked at the photograph. The boy, Nico, was still laughing at that thing off camera. He stopped. Started again. He looks like... I know what he looks like, Elena said quietly. That's why I sent the photograph instead of just writing. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the photograph, against the border of the boy's blue jacket. I want to meet him, Dante said. I know you do. Her voice was careful, not warm, not cold, carefully neutral in the way of someone who has thought about this conversation 100 times and decided that emotion is a luxury she can't afford right now. But I need you to understand something before we go any further. This is not a negotiation. This is not a deal. If you come into his life, you come in with the intention of staying. If you disappoint him, once, Dante, just once, you lose us both, permanently. And I am not making that threat. I am stating a fact. Dante, I understand. Do you? And there it was. The first crack in the careful neutrality, just a hairline fracture, but he heard it. Because the man I was married to was very good at understanding things in the moment and then doing exactly what was convenient for him afterward. The words landed. He didn't deflect them. "I know," he said. Silence on the line. The city hummed 40 floors below him. "Saturday," Elena finally said. "Riverside Park. 11 in the morning. Come alone. And for the love of everything, Dante, dress like a normal person." He didn't sleep Thursday, barely slept Friday. He stood in his closet at 8 o'clock Saturday morning staring at racks of suits that cost more than most people's cars and realized he didn't own anything that looked like a father. He ended up in dark jeans, a simple gray Henley, a jacket that his stylist had once called approachable. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized his own face, not because of the clothes, but because of the expression. He couldn't remember the last time he'd looked uncertain. His driver took him to the east entrance of Riverside Park, and he got out alone, hands in his pockets, and walked the path toward the lake. It was a clear morning, cool, the kind of early autumn day that smells like something ending. Joggers passed him. A couple walked a dog that kept pulling at its leash. Normal people doing normal things in the normal world that Dante Moretti had spent 20 years making sure he never had to live in. He saw them before they saw him. Elena was sitting on a bench near the duck pond, a paper coffee cup in both hands, watching a small figure at the water's edge. The boy was crouched down, tearing pieces off a slice of bread and throwing them with the maximum possible enthusiasm into the water. Every time a duck surged forward to grab a piece, Nico let out a sound of pure, uncomplicated delight, a laugh so clean it seemed to belong to a different world than the one Dante inhabited. Dante stopped walking. He stood on the path maybe 30 feet away and just looked. He counted the seconds without meaning to. The boy threw another piece of bread, laughed again, turned to say something to Elena, who smiled in a way that Dante had not seen her smile in a very long time. He became aware, standing there, that his chest hurt. Not physically. Something deeper. Something that didn't have a clean name in the vocabulary he'd built for himself. Elena saw him. She didn't wave. She just held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at Nico and said something quiet. The boy turned around. Dante watched his son look at him for the first time. Nico was small, smaller than Dante had somehow expected, even knowing he was 6, with dark hair that needed cutting, and Elena's jaw and Dante's eyes. He stared at the man on the path with an expression of frank, unguarded evaluation that children are capable of and adults spend their whole lives trying to recover. Then he walked over. Just walked straight over, bread still in his hand, without hesitation or performance. "Are you my dad?" he asked. The most feared man in 3 states stood on a park path and could not find a single word. "Mom said you might come today," Nico continued, apparently unbothered by the silence. "She said you've been very busy." He said this with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has been given this explanation many times and has quietly reserved judgment on it. Dante crouched down so they were eye level. This close, the resemblance was almost violent in its precision. "Yeah," he managed. "I'm your dad." Nico considered this, then, "How come you never came to my birthdays?" And there it was. Not thrown as an accusation, just asked plainly, the way a 6-year-old asks things, without the filters that adults construct to protect each other from the truth. Just a simple, direct question that landed in Dante's sternum like something blunt and heavy. He didn't reach for an excuse. He didn't manufacture a story. He looked at his son's face, at those eyes that were indisputably his, and said the only honest thing he had. "Because I didn't know about them. And that's something I have to live with." He paused. "But I'm here now." Nico processed this with the seriousness it deserved. Then he held out a piece of bread. "You can help me feed the ducks if you want," he said. "They really like the crust part." Dante took the bread. Elena watched from the bench, both hands around her cooling coffee, and did not let herself feel too much. She had prepared for this. She had rehearsed her own reactions the way she'd rehearsed everything in the last 6 years, carefully, privately, without anyone to help her carry the weight of it. She had told herself 100 times that Dante's presence in Nico's life did not change anything about her own life, that the man crouching by the duck pond in his expensive jacket was not her husband anymore, that the decision she'd made 6 years ago had been the right one, and nothing about today changed that. But watching Dante take that piece of bread from Nico's hand, watching the careful, almost terrified way he held it, like a man handling something he was afraid to break, she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt sorry for him, not in a soft way, not in a way that forgave everything, but in the way you feel sorry for someone who has just understood, too late, what they threw away, and has to stand in the wreckage of that understanding and figure out what to do next. She had made her terms clear on the phone. She'd meant every word. What she hadn't told him, what she couldn't tell him, not yet, was that in the 3 weeks since she'd mailed that envelope, she had received 2 separate visits from men she didn't recognize who'd asked questions about her address, her schedule, and whether she lived alone. She had told herself it was coincidence. She had told herself that Dante's world was his world, and it had nothing to do with her anymore. But she was no longer sure she believed that. She watched her son laugh at something Dante said. Actually laugh, head thrown back, the same laugh from the photograph. And she tightened her hands around the coffee cup and made herself breathe. Whatever was coming, she thought, it was already in motion. She just didn't know yet what shape it would take. The duck pond visit lasted 47 minutes. Dante knew because he checked his watch when he sat down beside Elena on the bench. An old habit, timing everything, measuring the world in intervals. And he checked it again when Nico finally ran out of bread and announced, with great authority, that the ducks had eaten enough and probably needed a nap. 47 minutes. In 47 minutes, his son had told him about a kid named Marcus at school who cheated at kickball, had explained in exhaustive detail why blue was a superior color to green, and had asked, completely without self-consciousness, whether Dante knew how to whistle because Nico was still working on it and needed someone to practice with. Dante had whistled. Nico had attempted to replicate it, produced a sound like air escaping a tire, and declared that he was almost there. 47 minutes, and Dante was already a different person than the one who'd walked into that park. He didn't say that to Elena. He said goodbye to Nico, who gave him a hug that lasted approximately 2 seconds and felt like being hit by something he had no defensive posture for. And he walked back to the car, and he sat in the back seat for a long time before telling his driver to move. Marco, who had been Dante's driver for 11 years and had learned to read silences the way other people read faces, said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then carefully, "Good morning, sir?" "Yeah," Dante said, still looking out the window. "Good morning." The meeting was already waiting for him. He'd pushed it twice. Once to take the park visit, once because he hadn't been ready to sit across from his captains and pretend the last 47 minutes hadn't happened. But Caruso didn't get pushed a third time. Vincent Caruso was Dante's senior underboss, a thick-necked man in his late 50s who had been with the Moretti family since before Dante took over, who wore the same style of suit he'd worn in 1987, and who communicated almost entirely in measured silences and the precise angle of his jaw. He was the most competent man in Dante's organization and the most dangerous one to underestimate. He was already in this conference room when Dante arrived, seated at the far end of the table, a glass of water untouched in front of him. 2 other captains were present, Luca Ferrante, who ran the port operations, and a younger man named Sal who had come up fast in the last 2 years and had the particular energy of someone who was always slightly too eager to demonstrate his usefulness. Dante sat down. He didn't take off his jacket. Caruso looked at him for a moment the way Caruso always looked at everything, with the flat, evaluating patience of a man who had outlived most of the people who'd ever underestimated him, and then said, "The Valdez situation needs a response. We've let it sit 3 weeks." "I know how long it's been sitting." "Then you know we look like we're hesitating." "We are hesitating. There's a difference between hesitating and being patient." Caruso picked up the glass of water, set it back down without drinking. "The difference," he said, "is one of them looks like strength." Dante met his eyes. "I'll handle the Valdez situation." "When?" "When I'm ready." Luca cleared his throat. He was a wiry man, nervous energy always leaking out of him in the form of finger tapping and small unnecessary movements. "The problem is the other families are watching. If they think we're—" "I know what they think." Dante's voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that had always worked better than volume. "And what they think doesn't change my timeline. Is that clear?" Luca nodded quickly. Sal stared at the table. Caruso said nothing, which was his way of making a point. Dante stood. "Luca, I need the port numbers by Thursday." "Sal, the Harrison Street situation gets resolved this week. Quietly. No bodies. I mean that literally. Vincent. He paused. Walk with me. The hallway outside the conference room was empty. Dante walked to the window at the far end. It looked out over the loading bays of the legitimate shipping company, whose third floor served as the organization's operational hub, and stood there with his hands in his jacket pockets. Caruso stood beside him. Both men looked at the trucks below. Say it, Dante said. You want me to say something? You've been wanting to say something since I walked in. Caruso was quiet for a moment, then, you went to see her. It wasn't a question. Dante had told no one, but Caruso had been in this business long enough that he had sources inside sources, and Dante had known, on some level, that the visit would get back to him within the day. Yes. And the boy? Yes. Another silence. Below them, a forklift moved a pallet of crates. Normal, everyday commerce. The machinery of the cover story. Dante. Caruso rarely used his first name. The fact that he used it now meant something. I've been with your family for 30 years. I held you at your father's funeral when you were 19 years old, and you didn't know yet how to be what this required you to be. I say this with respect and with genuine loyalty. He turned to look at him directly. Do not let sentiment compromise what we have built. Dante kept his eyes on the trucks. It's not sentiment. Then what is it? It's a correction. Caruso's expression didn't change, but something behind it shifted. Something subtle and not entirely comfortable. A correction, he repeated. I have a son. That changes the calculation. It changes your personal calculation. It does not change the operational reality. The Valdez family is testing us. 3 of our shipping contracts are under federal scrutiny. We have a window, a narrow one, to reinforce our position before I know the window. Dante turned to face him. And I'll act inside it, but not today. Today I have a school performance at 4 o'clock. The silence that followed was a different kind than before. Caruso looked at him for a long moment. A school performance. Nico's class is doing something. Elena sent the time. Dante held Caruso's gaze. I'm going. Caruso pressed his lips together, nodded once. I see. Good. Dante moved toward the elevator. Reschedule the Valdez conversation for Friday. He didn't look back, but he could feel Caruso watching him all the way down the hall. And in the weight of that gaze, in the particular quality of his senior underboss's silence, Dante heard something he hadn't heard from Vincent Caruso in 20 years. Doubt. The school performance was a disaster in the best possible way. 23 first graders performing some kind of musical theater piece about seasons, each of them visibly overwhelmed by the presence of parents, fully committed to their costumes, and roughly 40% aligned with the music the teacher was playing. Nico was a tree in the autumn segment. He had brown construction paper leaves taped to his arms, and a concentration on his face so intense that Dante, seated in a tiny plastic chair in the 3rd row, felt something happen in his chest that he could only describe as catastrophic. Elena sat beside him, 2 seats apart, her posture straight, her expression carefully parental. Proud, warm, present. She had dressed up slightly, which meant a blue blouse instead of the casual jacket from the park. She smelled like something clean, coffee and something floral. He did not think about that. When Nico spotted them in the crowd, his face changed in a way that was impossible to be neutral about. He'd expected to see his mother, the fact that his father was also there, that the man from the duck pond had actually come, hit him visibly, in real time, like a small detonation of something good. He nearly lost a leaf waving. Dante waved back. Elena noticed. She said nothing, but she reached into her bag for something, which was her version of giving him a private moment. Afterward, in the hallway, while other parents collected their construction paper children, Nico grabbed Dante's hand without preamble and pulled him toward the hallway bulletin board to show him a drawing that had been pinned there for 2 weeks. It was a family portrait, crayon on manila paper, clearly rendered before the park visit. There was a woman with dark hair, Elena, unmistakably, and a small figure that was Nico, and in the space where a father might have been, there was a blank. Not a scribbled-out blank, just a space, left deliberately empty, because the boy hadn't known what to put there yet. Nico looked at the drawing, then up at Dante, then back at the drawing. I didn't know what you looked like, he said, matter-of-factly. I could fix it now if Mrs. Okafor lets me. Dante stared at the blank space in that drawing for a beat too long. Yeah, he said. His voice came out wrong. rougher than intended. You could fix it. 3 days later, Caruso called a meeting Dante hadn't authorized. He found out about it at 7 in the morning, when his head of security, a former military man named Reese, who communicated exclusively in bullet points and blunt assessments, came to his penthouse and informed him that Caruso had convened Luca, Sal, and 2 of the port captains at the Harrison Street location the previous evening. No agenda sent to Dante. No notice. Dante was standing at the kitchen counter with a coffee he hadn't tasted yet. "How long?" he asked. 2.5 hours, Reese said. "We had a man on the door. Caruso swept for recording devices before they started." "Who else?" "Just the 5 of them, plus a man none of ours recognized. Arrived separate, left separate. We didn't get a clean ID." Dante set the coffee down. He looked out the window at the city below. Same view he'd stood at 100 mornings, feeling that gray nothing, and ran through the implications with the efficient coldness that had always been his greatest operational asset. An unauthorized meeting, a sweep for bugs, an unknown outside party. These were not the behaviors of loyal men having an informal conversation. "Don't move on anyone," he said. "Don't let them know we know. I want everything on Caruso for the next 72 hours. Calls, movements, contacts, everything." Reese nodded. "And if it's what it looks like?" Dante picked up his coffee. "Then I'll deal with it the way I deal with everything." He said it with the voice he'd always used for those conversations. Flat, final, carrying the specific gravity of a man who had dealt with things before and would again. But even as the words came out, some part of him registered the new complication underneath them. 6 months ago, dealing with it would have been straightforward. A message sent through the appropriate channels. A problem removed, clean and cold. Now there was a boy with construction paper leaves on his arms who still wanted to fix a crayon drawing, and the calculation was not as clean as it used to be. He told Elena about it on the phone that night. He hadn't planned to. He'd called to confirm pickup time for Saturday. Elena had agreed to supervised day visits, carefully structured, building towards something neither of them had named yet. And somewhere in the conversation, without quite deciding to, he said, "There may be some instability on my end. I want you to know about it." She was quiet for a moment. "What kind of instability?" "Internal. I'm handling it." "Dante." Her voice had that careful quality again. "Are we in danger?" He thought about the 2 men who'd visited her building 3 weeks ago, which Reese had flagged in a report that Dante had not yet been able to fully attribute. He thought about the unknown party at Caruso's unauthorized meeting. "I don't know yet," he said. "I want you to change your routine. Don't be predictable. Different times, different routes." "You're scaring me." "Good." Scared is alert. Alert is safer than comfortable. A long silence. "This is why I left, Dante. Not angry, not even accusatory, just tired in a way that had depth to it. This is exactly this. I know. Knowing doesn't fix it." "No," he said, "it doesn't." She hung up first. He sat with the dead phone in his hand and listened to the city outside his window doing what cities do, moving, grinding, indifferent, and made 2 decisions simultaneously. The first was that he needed to move on Caruso before Caruso moved on him. The second was that he needed to get Elena and Nico somewhere harder to reach, without telling Nico why, and without frightening Elena more than he already had. Both decisions required him to be the man he'd been before the envelope. He wasn't sure yet whether that man was still available. The confrontation with Caruso happened on a Wednesday, in the back room of a restaurant they'd used for private conversations for a decade. Dante arrived first. He was alone, which was a calculated risk. If Caruso was further along in whatever he was building than Dante believed, being alone was an exposed position. But bringing security sent a signal that would end the conversation before it started, and Dante needed to hear what Caruso said when he still thought he had the upper hand. Caruso arrived at 7. He sat down. He ordered nothing. A man who doesn't order in a restaurant he's visited 100 times is a man who doesn't intend to stay long. Dante looked at him across the table. "Tell me about Thursday night," Dante said. The fraction of a pause was enough. "Operational meeting. Luca had concerns about the port. You swept the room." Caruso's jaw tightened. "You swept the room," Dante said again, quietly. "Which means you weren't concerned about the port. You were concerned about who might be listening to whatever you were actually discussing." Caruso leaned back. The pretense dropped from his face like a coat sliding off a chair, and what was underneath was not the loyalty Dante had counted on for 20 years. It was something older and colder. Pragmatism. The kind that has decided sentiment is a luxury and survival is the only honest currency. You're changing, Caruso said. The whole organization sees it. People change. Not in this business. Not like this. He leaned forward and his voice dropped to something almost genuinely personal. I'm not your enemy, Dante. I'm telling you what the others won't say to your face, that missing sit-downs for school plays and taking personal calls in the middle of negotiations sends a signal. And the Valdez family received that signal. The Marchetti crew received it. There are conversations happening right now in rooms we don't control about whether the Moretti position can be taken, Dante finished. Caruso said nothing. That's the word you were avoiding. Taken. Dante set both hands flat on the table. Here's what I need you to understand, Vincent. I know what's being said. I know who's saying it. And I know about Thursday night, including the man who arrived separately and left separately, whose name I will have by the end of the week. He watched Caruso's face for the tell. It came, a slight stiffening around the eyes, a recalibration happening in real time. You have one opportunity, Dante said. Tell me who approached you and what they offered. Do it now, in this room, and we have a conversation about how to move forward. Don't tell me. He paused. And we have a different kind of conversation entirely. The restaurant hummed around them. Silverware, low voices, the smell of food being cooked for people who had no idea what was happening 8 feet away in the back room. Caruso looked at him for a long moment, and then he said, The Marchetti family reached out 6 weeks ago. They have a federal contact who's been building a case against us. They offered protection from that case in exchange for a transition of leadership. Dante breathed through his nose. You were going to help them remove me. I was going to consider it, Caruso said, with a precision that was almost admirable. There's a difference. In what universe? In the universe where the alternative is watching 20 years of work collapse because you found out you have a kid. His voice cracked on the last word, not with emotion, but with something that might have been, in another version of this man, genuine frustration. You are not the same person who built this, and the people who depend on it need someone who still is. Dante sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. Then he said, Get out of this organization by Friday. Clean exit. You walk away from everything, accounts, contacts, positions, and you keep your life. That's the offer. It expires when you leave this table. Caruso stared at him. That's the offer, Dante said again. One time. Slowly, with the particular heaviness of a man watching a version of the future he'd planned collapse in front of him, Caruso stood. He straightened his jacket, same style as 1987, same habit, and he looked at Dante with something that was not quite respect and not quite hatred, but existed somewhere in the deteriorated territory between them. You're going to lose it all anyway, he said. The only question is whether you lose it fighting or whether you lose it because you stopped fighting. He walked out. Dante sat alone in the back room of the restaurant and listened to the silverware and the low voices and the cooking smells, and understood, with a clarity that had no comfort in it, that Caruso was probably right about one thing. The Marchetti family had a federal contact, which meant the case Reese had been tracking as a distant concern was no longer distant. It was active. It was resourced. And now that Dante had moved on Caruso without knowing the full shape of what Caruso had been building, the people Caruso had been coordinating with would know within 24 hours that the meeting hadn't gone the way they'd planned, which meant whatever they were going to do next, they were going to do it faster. He took out his phone and called Reese. I need a location for Elena and Nico, he said when Reese picked up. Somewhere I control, somewhere secure, somewhere she won't know is connected to me. I need it by tomorrow morning. That's a short timeline. I know. And Reese, he stopped, rubbed the back of his neck. Do it quietly. She's already frightened. I don't want her knowing how bad it actually is. He hung up, sat alone another minute. Then he called Elena. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she'd been awake, which meant she'd been waiting for something without being sure what. I need you to take Nico somewhere for a few days, he said. The pause that followed had a specific texture. How few? I don't know yet. Dante. Elena. His voice came out harder than he intended, and he moderated it. I need you to trust me, just this once. I know I have not given you a lot of reasons to trust me, and I understand what I'm asking, but I need you to take Nico and go where I tell you to go, and I need you to do it tonight. The silence stretched. Is he in danger? she asked. Not panicked, just direct, asking the exact question that mattered. He thought about the Marchetti family's federal contact. He thought about the unknown man at Caruso's meeting. He thought about the two men who'd visited her building 3 weeks ago. He was about to say, "I don't know," which was the truthful answer. But before he could, his phone buzzed with an incoming message from Reese. He glanced at the screen. It was a photograph. Security camera footage, timestamped from 40 minutes ago. Two men he didn't recognize standing outside Elena's building. Not the same two men from before. Different ones. "Yes," he said into the phone. "He's in danger. Pack a bag. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was already standing, already moving toward the door, already running the angles of every exit and every threat vector in the city between the restaurant and Elena's apartment, when his phone buzzed again. This time it was a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Something made him answer. The voice on the other end was calm, male, and completely unfamiliar. "Mr. Moretti," it said, "we have a mutual problem. I think you already know what it is, and I think you know that whatever you're planning to do in the next 20 minutes isn't going to be enough." Dante stopped walking. "Who is this?" he said. "Someone who's been watching Vincent Caruso for 6 months for reasons that have nothing to do with you, and who just watched you have a conversation with him that changes everything for both of us." A brief pause. "My name is irrelevant. What's relevant is that I know where the Marchetti family's federal asset is embedded. I know the timeline of the operation against you, and I know that your son's mother was photographed leaving her building this morning by people who are not police. The street outside the restaurant was cold, clear, ordinary. People walking past with their hands in their pockets, their breath fogging in the autumn air, living in the clean world on the other side of everything Dante had built. "Talk," Dante said. "Not on the phone. I'll send an address." Another pause. "And Mr. Moretti, go to her building first. Go now. The men outside won't move until they have an order, but that order is coming." The call ended. Dante stood on the sidewalk for exactly 1 second, long enough to decide, and then he was running. He ran 4 blocks. Not because his car wasn't available. Marco was parked on the corner, engine running, 30 seconds away. But because running was the only thing his body knew how to do with the current moving through it. 4 blocks through autumn sidewalks, with his jacket open and his breath coming hard and people stepping out of his way, because something in the way he moved communicated clearly that this was not a man you wanted to be in front of right now. He hit the car door. Marco had it moving before Dante was fully in the seat. "Elena's building," Dante said. "Now. Don't stop for anything." Marco didn't ask questions. He never asked questions, which was the primary reason he was still alive and employed after 11 years. He pulled into traffic with the particular aggressive patience of a man who has navigated this city under pressure enough times to know exactly which rules to break and which ones to respect. Dante called Reese from the back seat. "The 2 men outside her building," he said, the moment Reese picked up. "What are they doing right now?" "Still outside, south entrance. 1 on the steps, 1 near the parking structure." "They're not moving?" "Not yet." "Stay on them. If either one reaches for a phone, I need to know immediately." He hung up and called Elena. She picked up mid-first ring. "Don't go outside," he said. "Don't open the door for anyone. I'm 4 minutes away." "Dante, what is 4 minutes? Pack what Nico needs for 3 days, just essentials. Can you do that right now?" He heard her breathing shift, the specific rhythm of someone fighting down panic and winning, barely. "Yes." "Good. 4 minutes." He ended the call and looked out the window at the city moving past and made himself breathe at a controlled rate because panic was a resource drain and he couldn't afford it. He ran the geometry of the situation in his head, the way he'd run hundreds of operational problems over 20 years. Inputs, variables, unknown factors, probable outcomes. And what he arrived at was not comforting. The unknown caller knew things that only 2 categories of people could know. Someone embedded inside the Marchetti operation, or someone with a surveillance capability that extended across multiple organizations simultaneously. Either option was sophisticated. Either option changed the shape of whatever Dante thought he was dealing with. And Caruso had said 6 weeks. The Marchetti family had approached Caruso 6 weeks ago, which meant they'd been planning this transition for at least that long, which meant the federal case Caruso had mentioned was not newly assembled. It had history. It had depth. It had possibly sources inside Dante's own operation that went beyond Caruso. The car stopped outside Elena's building. Dante was out before it fully halted. The man on the steps, young, thick through the shoulders, wearing a jacket too heavy for the weather, clocked Dante the moment he hit the sidewalk. Their eyes met. The man's hand moved toward his jacket and then stopped, because something in Dante's face communicated that this particular calculation should be reconsidered. Dante walked past him without breaking stride and went through the front door. He took the stairs. Elena had the bag packed. Of course she did. She'd had it sitting by the door before he even called, which meant she'd been expecting this. Not this specifically, but something like this, some version of the night that ends with a bag by the door, for longer than she'd admitted on the phone. Nico was in his pajamas, holding a stuffed animal of indeterminate species with the serious calm of a child who understands that something important is happening and has decided that being difficult about it would be wrong. He looked at Dante when Dante came through the door and said, with extraordinary composure for a 6-year-old at 11 at night, "Are we going on a trip?" "Yeah, buddy," Dante said. He crouched down. "A short one. Can I bring Gus?" The stuffed animal. "Gus is mandatory." Nico nodded gravely, satisfied. He looked at his mother. "I need my blue socks." "They're in the bag," Elena said. "The ones with the stripes." "Yes, they're in the bag." Dante stood. He and Elena looked at each other across the apartment, across 6 years of accumulated distance, and the 47 minutes at the duck pond and every phone call since, and the photograph that had started all of it. And there was a conversation that happened entirely without words, the way it can between two people who once knew each other well enough to anticipate the sentence before it started. She was frightened. She was also, underneath the fear, furious. Not at him specifically, or not only at him, but at the situation, at the world he'd built, at the fact that she'd spent 6 years protecting her son from exactly this, and here it was at her door anyway. He was sorry. He was also useless at saying so in any way that would help. "Let's go," he said. Marco drove them to a property on the city's eastern edge, a townhouse registered to a holding company that had no traceable connection to the Moretti organization, staffed by 2 people Dante trusted more than almost anyone alive. A woman named Iris, who had been his father's bookkeeper, and who possessed, underneath a grandmotherly exterior, the operational instincts of someone who had survived 3 regime changes in this organization without ever being implicated in anything. And a man named Dove, former private security, who communicated mainly through nods and was physically capable of ending most problems before they reached a door. Elena walked through the townhouse without comment. She assessed it the way she assessed everything, quietly, thoroughly, without showing what she concluded. She put Nico in the bedroom at the back, the one without street-facing windows, and stayed with him until he was asleep, which took 11 minutes because Nico was wired from the unusual night, but was fundamentally a child who trusted that his mother had things handled. Dante waited in the kitchen. He drank water because his mouth was dry, and coffee would have been too much. He sat at the kitchen table in his expensive jacket in an ordinary kitchen and looked at the ordinary refrigerator covered in ordinary magnets that Iris had put there because she believed in making spaces feel inhabited, and tried to identify what he was feeling underneath the operational momentum. It was something close to grief. Not the clean kind. The kind that comes from understanding exactly how you arrived at a crisis, and being unable to identify a single decision you could have made differently that would have prevented it, because every decision had followed logically from the previous one, all the way back to a conference room and a woman in a gray dress, and the thing you'd called relief. Elena came into the kitchen. She sat across from him. She did not have coffee or water or anything. She just sat down and put her hands flat on the table and looked at him. "Tell me," she said. "There's a faction inside my organization that's been working with a rival family to remove me. They may also have a federal asset. Tonight I confronted my senior underboss about it. He didn't deny it." "So they know you know?" "Yes." "And that makes us a potential pressure point." "Yes." She absorbed this. Her face didn't change, but her hands pressed slightly harder against the table surface. A small, controlled release of something she wasn't letting into her expression. "I have a contact I haven't verified yet," Dante said. "Someone who claims to know the shape of the operation against me. I'm meeting him tomorrow." "Alone?" "I don't know yet." "Dante." Her voice was steady in the way of something pulled tight. "I need to understand the actual level of danger, not the managed version, the real one." He looked at her hands on the table. He thought about what Reese had sent him. the second set of men outside her building, different from the first set, and thought about what that duplication implied. Planning, resources, a timeline that was already moving. "Hi," he said. "The danger is high." She closed her eyes for exactly 2 seconds, then opened them. "Okay? Okay? What do you need me to do?" He hadn't expected that. He'd expected the version of this conversation where she told him, with full justification, that this was exactly what she'd spent 6 years avoiding, and that every choice he'd made had led them here, and she couldn't protect their son from a life she'd never consented to enter. He'd been prepared for that version. He was not prepared for okay. "Stay here," he said. "Keep Nico in a routine as much as you can. Don't use your phone. Iris has a clean one you can use. Don't contact anyone outside this building without running it by me or Reese." She nodded. Then she said, quietly, in a different tone than before, more personal, the careful neutrality lowered slightly. "Are you going to be okay?" He looked at her for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. She nodded again, as if that was acceptable, and stood up. She was at the kitchen doorway when he said her name. She stopped, but didn't fully turn. "I'm sorry," he said. "For all of it." She was quiet for a moment. "I know you are." She paused. "That's not the same as it being enough. But I know." She went to the room at the back of the house near their son, and Dante sat alone in the kitchen with the refrigerator magnets and the cold water and the weight of everything that was already in motion. The address the unknown caller sent was a parking structure in the warehouse district. Level 4, the northeast corner, midnight. Dante brought Reese and one additional man, both hanging back far enough to be useful without being visible. He understood this was potentially a trap. He also understood that not going was a different kind of trap, the kind where you die of what you don't know. The man was already there when Dante arrived. He was standing beside a concrete pillar with his hands visible, and his posture carrying the specific relaxed alertness of former law enforcement or military, someone trained to appear unthreatening while being neither. He was roughly Dante's age, early 40s, with a forgettable face and the kind of eyes that moved and cataloged constantly without appearing to. He was wearing a dark coat. He held no weapon that Dante could see, which meant either he was clean or he was very good. "Mr. Moretti," he said. "You have a name," Dante said. Not a question. "Garrett." No last name offered. "I work for an oversight body I'm not going to name, focused on organized crime network mapping, not prosecution, mapping. Understanding how organizations connect and where they're vulnerable. I've been surveilling the Marchetti family for 8 months. And Caruso. Caruso came up 4 months ago. When he made contact with the Marchetti family, I became very interested in what they were offering him." Garrett tilted his head slightly, "which is when I found out about the federal asset." Dante kept his face neutral. "Tell me about the asset." Garrett looked at him for a moment. "Before I do, I need you to understand what I'm doing here and what I'm not. I am not offering you protection. I am not making a deal. I have operational reasons for wanting the Marchetti network disrupted before a specific event in the next 30 days, and your situation has become relevant to that objective. So I'm a tool. You're a person whose interests currently align with mine. That's as warm as this gets." Dante almost smiled. "Fair enough." The asset. Garrett reached into his coat, slowly, visibly, making sure Dante's hand stayed still, and produced a folded document. He held it out. Dante took it. He unfolded it. It was a personnel file, partial, with certain fields redacted, but enough. A name, a photograph, a position description. Dante read it once. Then he read it again because the first reading had produced a response he needed to verify before trusting. The federal asset embedded in the Moretti organization, the source who had been feeding case-building information to the FBI's Organized Crime Division for an estimated 14 months, was not Caruso, was not Luca, was not Sal or any of the port captains. It was Reese, Dante's head of security, the man who had been controlling all incoming threat intelligence for 4 years, the man who had told Dante about Caruso's unauthorized meeting, the man who Dante had just called from the car on the way to Elena's building and told, in explicit detail, where he was taking her. The man who was standing 40 feet away right now, at the edge of the parking structure, watching the meeting. Dante folded the document. He put it in his jacket pocket. He kept his face exactly where it was, neutral, unhurried, a man processing information in an orderly way, because Reese was 40 feet away and capable of reading micro-expressions at distance. 20 years of surviving in this world had trained Dante to perform stillness under conditions that would produce visible panic in anyone else, and he called on every year of that training now, because what was happening inside his chest was neither still nor orderly. 14 months. Reese had been feeding information for 14 months. Every threat Dante had been warned about in that period. Every operation Reese had flagged as compromised. Every rival move Dante had been positioned to counter. Every piece of intelligence Dante had used to make decisions had been filtered through a man who was simultaneously transmitting the organizational map to federal investigators. And Dante had put Elena and Nico's location in Reese's hands 40 minutes ago. He breathed through his nose. In for 4 counts. Out for 4 counts. A technique he'd learned from a man who is probably dead now, used for the first time in years, because the alternative was doing something right here in this parking structure that would eliminate the only person who currently knew where his family was. "How current is this?" he asked Garrett. His voice was even, professionally even, the kind of even that costs something. "The file is 6 weeks old. The intelligence suggests he's still active." "Does he know you have this?" "No." "Does anyone else know you're here tonight?" Garrett paused 1 beat too long. "No." Dante looked at him. That pause. Garrett's expression shifted. The first genuine thing in it since they'd started talking. Something that might have been reluctant respect. "There's a secondary surveillance team. They're not here for you. They're here for me. My organization monitors meetings like this for oversight reasons." "Are they recording?" "Yes." Dante thought about what that recording would contain. His face. This conversation. The document Garrett had just handed him. Depending on what framework Garrett's unnamed organization operated under and what they chose to do with what they recorded, tonight could be either protection or additional exposure. He decided it was a problem for later. Right now, there was only one problem. "I need to make a call," he said. I assumed. He walked 4 paces away and turned his back and took out his phone. He did not call the number he had for Reese. He called Marco. Marco answered immediately. "Sir." "The townhouse. Right now. Don't call ahead. Don't use your radio. Go directly there, and don't let anyone inside who isn't already inside. Do you understand me?" A beat. Marco understood enough not to ask. "Yes, sir." "Move." He hung up. He stood with the phone in his hand and looked at the concrete floor of the parking structure and did the mathematics. Marco was 18 minutes from the townhouse. Reese, if he'd already made a call, could have a response there in 15. 13 minutes if the response was already staged nearby. Dante did not know whether Reese had heard enough of the conversation with Garrett to act immediately, or whether he was still waiting for the meeting to conclude and for Dante to return before making any move. He turned around. Garrett was watching him with the expression of a man who has seen people absorb bad news many times and understands that the absorbing takes whatever shape it takes. "The man I came with tonight," Dante said, "the one standing by the east stairwell. I need him detained, not harmed, detained, and his phone taken, for the next 40 minutes. Garrett considered this for a moment. "That's not a simple request." "I know. If I do that, you owe me something that isn't just aligned interests." "Name it. When this is over, when whatever you're about to do is done, I want a full accounting of the Marchetti Network's domestic operations. Everything you know." Dante thought about what that meant, what it cost. "Everything I know destroys what's left of my own organization along with theirs." "Yes," Garrett said simply. "It does." The city hummed below the open sides of the parking structure. Somewhere in it, in a townhouse with refrigerator magnets, his son was sleeping with a stuffed animal named Gus and blue-striped socks in a bag, trusting that the adults in his life had things handled. "Done," Dante said. Garrett took out his own phone and made a call of roughly 12 seconds. He said 2 sentences that Dante couldn't fully hear and then put the phone away. 40 minutes, Garrett said. "After that, I can't hold him." Dante was already moving toward his car. He drove himself, the first time in 4 years, because Marco was headed to the townhouse and there was no one else he trusted with the wheel right now, and the act of driving, the physical necessity of it, gave his hands something to do besides shake. He pushed the car through the late-night streets with precise, controlled aggression, taking the fastest route, Red lights treated as suggestions, and tried not to think about the 14 months. About every conversation he'd had in front of Reese. Every decision made with Reese's intelligence informing it. And here was where the architecture of it became genuinely nauseating. Every move he'd made since Elena's envelope arrived, discussed in Reese's presence, including the envelope itself, including the park visit, including the school performance, including the location of the townhouse. Reese had given the FBI a 14-month map of the Moretti organization. He had also, possibly, given the Marchetti family, through whatever arrangement existed between the federal asset and the rival organization, a real-time map of where Dante's family was sleeping tonight. He pressed the accelerator. The townhouse came into view at the end of the residential block. Lights on in the front. Marco's car at the curb, which meant Marco had made it. No other vehicles he didn't recognize. He pulled up, got out, and covered the distance to the front door in seconds. Iris opened it before he knocked. Her face told him nothing had happened yet. "Anyone come to the door?" he asked. "No one." "Marco?" "In the kitchen." He explained. Not much, but enough. She stepped back to let him in. "Dante." She used his name the way Elena had used it, like something being handled carefully. The boy woke up when Marco arrived. "Elena's with him. He's asking for you." He stopped in the hallway. In the entire compressed catastrophe of the last 3 hours, the parking structure, the document, Reese's face at the edge of the concrete level, the 14 months, the drive, he had been operating in the pure executive register, the cold, clear zone where decisions get made and consequences are deferred. It was the zone that had kept him alive for 20 years, the zone he retreated to when everything else was chaos. But standing in the hallway of a townhouse with refrigerator magnets, being told that his 6-year-old son had woken up and was asking for him, the zone faltered. Not collapsed. He couldn't afford collapse, but faltered, genuinely, in a way it hadn't in a very long time. He walked to the back bedroom. He knocked once, softly. Elena opened the door. She looked at his face, and whatever she read there made her step aside without a word. Nico was sitting up in bed, Gus in his lap, his dark hair going in 4 directions, looking simultaneously very small and very alert in the way of children who wake up somewhere unfamiliar and are being extremely brave about it. "I heard a car," Nico said. "That was Marco," Dante said. He sat on the edge of the bed. "He's a friend." Nico processed this. Is something bad happening? Dante looked at his son. He thought about the clean, uncalculated way Nico asked questions, without filters, without cushioning, just the direct nerve of it. He thought about a crayon drawing with a blank space where a father should be. "There's some stuff I have to handle," he said. "But you're safe here, both of you. That I can promise." Nico looked at him for a long, serious moment with those eyes. Those exact eyes. And then he said, "Okay." And then, in the tone of someone making a practical decision, "You can stay in here if you want. There's room." Dante looked at Elena, who was standing in the doorway with her arms crossed in an expression he couldn't fully read. Too many layers, too much history, too much of tonight in it. She nodded slightly. He stayed. He sat in the chair beside the bed with his jacket still on and listened to Nico's breathing slow and deepen back into sleep, and he sat with the full weight of what was true tonight. Reese had burned him. The federal case was not coming. It was already built, already aimed. Caruso was gone, but the damage Caruso had helped architect was already structural. The Marchetti family would know by morning that their inside line had been compromised. And Dante had just agreed to give Garrett everything he knew about the Marchetti network, which meant agreeing to the end of the Moretti organization as a functional entity, which meant agreeing to the end of everything he had spent 20 years becoming. All of it, over. Or becoming over. The mechanism was already running. And sitting in a chair beside his sleeping son in a townhouse that smelled like Iris's cooking and someone else's ordinary life, Dante Moretti understood something that no amount of power or money or ruthless operational clarity had ever managed to teach him. The only thing he'd ever built that was worth keeping was breathing quietly 6 feet away, holding a stuffed animal named Gus, trusting that his father had things handled. He had one move left. It wasn't a Mafia boss's move. It wasn't the move of the man who had made senators beg and rival bosses weep. It was the move of something he'd never tried to be before, and he didn't know yet if he was capable of it. But he was going to find out, because the alternative was watching it all come down on the people in this room, and that was the one outcome he would not survive. He He took out his phone in the dark and opened a message to Garrett. 3 words. I'm ready. Tomorrow. He sent it and put the phone away and sat in the chair until the room was fully quiet and his son was sleeping and the night outside the window was as still as anything in his life was ever going to be again. And then he closed his eyes and made himself breathe, because what was coming tomorrow would require him to be the most awake he had ever been, not as the man the Empire had made him, but as something the Empire never had room for. A father with nothing left to lose and one person left worth saving everything for. He didn't sleep. He sat in that chair until 4 in the morning, listening to Nico breathe, and then he got up quietly and went to the kitchen and stood at the window with cold water and watched the street outside cycle through the particular emptiness of pre-dawn, the hour when the city belongs to no one, when even the things that move in darkness have gone still. He thought about Reese. He thought about 14 months. He thought about every conversation, every briefing, every threat assessment that had passed through Reese's hands, and simultaneously into a federal file somewhere. He tried to identify the moment, some specific exchange, some particular meeting, where he should have seen it. He couldn't find one. That was the thing about a genuinely good inside man. They didn't make mistakes you could catch. They made omissions so surgical you never felt the cut. At 5:15, Garrett responded to his message. An address, a time. 9 a.m. A different location than the parking structure. A diner, which meant public, which meant Garrett wanted witnesses to whatever Dante was about to agree to, or wanted Dante to feel safe enough to talk clearly. Possibly both. At 6, Marco knocked on the kitchen door frame. He was holding 2 coffees from somewhere, which meant he'd left briefly and come back, which meant either the perimeter was clear or Marco had decided coffee was worth the risk, which told Dante something about Marco's assessment of the immediate threat level. Anything move last night? Dante asked. Nothing on this block. Reese's car left the parking structure around 1 a.m. Marco set 1 coffee on the counter. I ran the plate on the second set of men from her building. They're Marchetti. I know. You knew last night? I knew enough. Marco was quiet for a moment. He was a careful man in the way that people who have worked in dangerous proximity to dangerous people for a long time become careful. Not timid, but deliberate, measuring everything before committing to it. What do you need today? Dante picked up the coffee. I need you here, with them. All day, no exceptions. Iris and Dove stay on the doors. Nobody enters without my direct authorization on the clean phone. And Reese? Don't contact him. Don't respond if he contacts you. If he shows up in person... Dante stopped. He thought about Reese's face in the parking structure, 40 feet away, watching the meeting. The face he'd worked beside for 4 years. Don't let him through the door. Marco nodded. No visible reaction to the implication of it. Understood. If I'm not back by 6 tonight, call the number Garrett gives you and tell him the situation changed. And if you're not back by 6 because something happened to you? Dante looked at him. Then the priority is the woman and the boy, not me. Do you understand that? Marco held his gaze for a moment, then quietly. Yes, sir. Elena was up when he went to say he was leaving. She was in the narrow hallway outside the back bedroom, still in the clothes she'd worn last night, her hair pulled back with the kind of efficiency that communicated she hadn't slept either. She looked at him, at the coat he was putting on, at the controlled way he was moving, and read the situation without needing it explained. How bad is today? She asked. Significant. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. I don't know exactly what I'm walking into. She crossed her arms. Not defensive, steadying. And afterward? What does afterward look like? He thought about what he'd agreed to with Garrett. The full accounting. The Marchetti network. The end of everything. Different than before, he said. A lot different. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she'd looked at him across the conference room table 6 years ago. That same quality of seeing through the surface, reading whatever was underneath it. Different how? Smaller, he said, but real. Something moved in her face. Not warmth, exactly. Not forgiveness. That was a longer road than one night in a townhouse kitchen. But something that recognized the sentence for what it was. An honest one. Possibly the most honest thing he'd said to her in their combined years of knowing each other. Come back, she said. 2 words. Just that. He left. The diner was the kind of place that had been in the same location for 30 years and would outlast every business around it on the strength of reliable coffee and no pretension. Garrett was already in a corner booth, a cup in front of him, a newspaper on the table that he wasn't reading. He looked up when Dante came in and made no move, which was its own kind of statement. Dante sat across from him. "Reese is in the wind," Garrett said, before Dante could speak. He left the parking structure, drove to his apartment, and was gone by 2 a.m. Our people lost him on the interstate. He had a bag, which means he knew we'd made him. He figured it out at the parking structure, probably when you walked away to make the call. Garrett wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. Here's what that means operationally. Reese goes directly to his federal handlers, who panic, who immediately try to accelerate or protect the case they've been building. Simultaneously, Reese goes to whoever in the Marchetti organization he's been sharing with and tells them the meeting happened and you now know about the asset. Dante watched him. So the Marchetti family knows by morning that their inside line is burned, and that you know, which means they move today. Dante said it flat, without inflection, because saying it with inflection would have required having somewhere to put the feeling that came with it. They can't wait. If they wait, I use what I know to dismantle them from the outside before they can act from the inside. So they move today. That is my assessment, Garrett said. Yes, and Elena and Nico. Garrett set his cup down. They know about the townhouse, Dante. Reese knew the address. He had 30 minutes between when you called him from the car and when my people detained him at the parking structure. That's enough time to pass an address. The diner moved around them. A waitress refilling someone's cup. A man in a work jacket reading his phone. 2 older women talking about something involving a garden. Normal morning, normal world. Dante looked at the table surface. He breathed. Then we need to move them again. I've already arranged it. There's a location my organization controls, fully sterile, no connection to you or to anything connected to you. I can have them moved within the hour if you authorize it. Why would you do that? Because I need you functional today. And you're not functional if you're thinking about them every 30 seconds. It was the most pragmatic expression of protection Dante had ever heard, and somehow that made it more trustworthy than if Garrett had dressed it in sentiment. What do you need from me today? He asked. Garrett opened the newspaper up, not to read it, but to produce a single folded sheet from between its pages, which he slid across the table. Dante unfolded it. It was a location, a waterfront warehouse complex on the city's southern edge. Below the address, a name, Raymond Marchetti. Not the family patriarch, the operating son, the one who actually ran the day-to-day structure, the one Dante had met twice at intermediary events and assessed as intelligent in the way that men who've been handed power tend to be intelligent, effectively, within limits, and deeply vulnerable to their own certainty. Raymond is coordinating the operation against you personally, Garrett said. The patriarch stays clean. He always stays clean. That's how the family has survived 4 decades. Raymond does the work and the old man maintains deniability. If you want to end this, Raymond is the point of pressure. You want me to confront him. I want you to be present when I do. What you do or don't do in that room is your decision. Garrett paused. But I'll tell you what I know, which is that Raymond has spent the last 6 weeks building something that requires your organization to be either absorbed or destroyed in the next 72 hours. Caruso was the inside man who would have managed the transition. With Caruso gone, Raymond has to improvise. Improvised men make mistakes. Dante folded the paper and put it in his pocket beside the document from last night. 2 pieces of paper that together constituted the complete demolition of his life as it had existed for 20 years. He thought briefly about the version of himself who had sat in a conference room and slid divorce papers across a table with the serene certainty of a man who controlled everything. That man had not known what control actually cost. When? He said. 2 hours. I'll drive. They didn't make it 2 hours. Dante's clean phone rang at 9:47. It was Marco. When Marco called instead of texting, it meant something had already happened. He answered. Talk. They moved on us. Marco's voice was steady, the way a man's voice is steady when it has to be, when the alternative is losing the thread of what needs to happen next. 20 minutes ago, 4 men, 2 vehicles. They hit the front and the side entrance simultaneously. Dove is down. He's breathing. They didn't kill him, but he's not moving. Iris is... A brief pause. Iris held the back. She's okay. Elena, Nico. They took them. The diner disappeared. Everything in Dante's field of vision narrowed to the phone in his hand and the table surface and Marco's voice in his ear. "Where?" he said. The word came out like a thing with no softness in it, scraped clean of everything except the question. "I don't know yet. I'm running the vehicles. One of them I got a partial plate." "Run it. Call me back in 5 minutes." He looked at Garrett across the table. Garrett had read the shape of the call from Dante's face and was already on his own phone. They hit the townhouse. They have Elena and Nico. Garrett said 2 sentences into his phone, listened, and said, "Raymond's location. My people just confirmed he's there, which means he moved early, which means he's rattled. Rattled men run the play they prepared instead of adapting. And the play he prepared is to use them to bring you in. On his terms. On his ground." Garrett stood. He put money on the table without counting it, which means they're alive, and they'll stay alive until he has you in the room. Dante was already standing. "He wants a meeting. He wants you to walk into that warehouse and hand him whatever leverage makes this go away on his terms. He thinks you'll do it because of the boy." Dante moved toward the door. "He's not entirely wrong. He is wrong," Garrett said, following him, "about what happens once you're inside." The waterfront complex was 4 interconnected warehouse buildings on a pier that had been commercially dormant for 3 years, the kind of location that exists in every major port city, perpetually in some phase of redevelopment that never quite materializes, which makes it permanently useful to people who need space without visibility. Garrett's people had a position established on the water side and one on the north end of the access road. Not tactical, observational, with communication capability. Whatever happened inside was happening without a coordinated extraction team, because coordinated extraction teams leave evidence trails, and Garrett had been very clear about the nature of his organization's involvement, adjacent, not participating. Dante understood. He'd operated in adjacent arrangements his entire career. He knew exactly what it meant. It meant he was going in with Marco, who had arrived in a second vehicle, and who was the best close-quarters asset Dante had in an organization that was currently in the process of not existing anymore. 2 men and the full weight of everything at stake. He'd gone in with worse. The main entrance was a rolling industrial door on the south face of the building, and it was open, which told Dante that Raymond wanted him to come in through the front, wanted the arrival to feel like a choice rather than what it was. Dante obliged, because the entrance you choose matters less than what you do once you're past it. He and Marco went through the door. The interior of the warehouse was large and cold, and smelled like salt water and old timber, and the particular industrial emptiness of a space that has been repurposed too many times to have a smell of its own anymore. The ceiling was high. The light came from portable work lamps positioned at intervals that illuminated the center of the space and left the edges in varying degrees of dark. There were men positioned at those edges. Dante counted 6 in the first sweep, understood there were likely more he couldn't see, and adjusted his operational picture accordingly. In the center of the space, under the work lamps, were 2 chairs. Elena was in one of them. She was upright, her hands bound behind the chair with something plastic. Zip ties, not rope, which told Dante the men who'd taken her had come prepared and in a hurry. There was a bruise forming on her left cheekbone that hadn't been there this morning, and seeing it produced something in Dante's chest that was not grief and not anger and not fear, but something underneath all 3 that had no name he knew, only temperature and weight. She looked at him when he came in. Her eyes were clear, frightened, yes, but clear, awake, tracking, her chin at an angle that told him she was holding herself together by choice, not by accident, and intended to keep doing so. Nico was in the chair beside her. He was not bound. Someone had made the call that a 6-year-old didn't require restraint, which was either a small mercy or an oversight, and Dante didn't care which. Nico's face was different from his mother's. He wasn't trying to manage his expression. He was just looking at Dante with those eyes. Those exact eyes. And the look was not fear, precisely. It was the look of a child who has decided that the situation is very serious and that his father being present in it is the most important fact available. Dante crossed the distance to them in 10 steps. He crouched in front of Nico first. "You okay?" he said. "Yeah." Nico's voice was small but solid. "Mom told me to be quiet, and I was." "Good." He looked at Elena. "You?" "Standing." She glanced at his face. "The bruise is from the door when they rushed us. Don't—" She stopped. She'd read something in his expression that she wanted to moderate. Don't make decisions about it right now. He stood up. Raymond Marchetti came from the far end of the warehouse, walking the way men walk when they've arranged the environment to demonstrate their control over it. Unhurried, proprietary, a man arriving to a meeting he convened. He was 44, heavy through the shoulders, with a face that might have been pleasant under different conditions. He was wearing a coat that cost as much as Dante's and carrying no visible weapon, which meant the weapon was close, and he felt no need to demonstrate it. He stopped 10 feet away. Dante, he said. Familiar. First name. The performance of ease. Dante looked at him and said nothing. Raymond's jaw tightened slightly at the silence. You've had a complicated few days. Say what you're here to say. I'm here to make an offer, the same offer I made to Caruso, except now we skip the intermediary. Raymond glanced at Elena and Nico with the specific brand of calculated casualness that is designed to communicate a threat without technically making one. You walk away from the organization. Everything. Accounts, operations, properties, contacts. You sign whatever legal documentation my attorneys have prepared, which legitimizes the transfer of assets. You take your family and you go somewhere quiet, and the federal case against you gets quietly complicated in ways that make prosecution unlikely. Y pues, mumpem. And if I don't? Raymond looked at him. Then the case isn't complicated, and the people in those chairs become a problem that resolves itself in a way that I'll personally regret, but won't lose sleep over. Dante breathed. In, out. He was aware of Marco at his left shoulder, aware of the 6 visible men at the warehouse perimeter, aware of the distance between himself and Raymond between Raymond and the nearest of those men, aware of the weight and the temperature and the angle of every physical fact in the room. All right, he said. Raymond blinked. He'd expected negotiation. He'd prepared for negotiation. The immediate agreement hit him wrong, and Dante watched him work through whether to trust it or probe it. All right, Raymond repeated. I'll sign whatever you have, but I want them out of this building first. Walking out that door, getting in a car, and gone. Then I sign. You sign first. They leave first. Raymond's eyes moved to Elena and Nico and back. He was calculating the value of the guarantee, the risk of the sequence. He wanted the signature more than he wanted leverage, because the signature was the clean ending, the untraceable transfer, the thing that made the acquisition legal, and the acquisition was worth more than whatever point he made by refusing. Fine, he said. 2 of my men drive them to a location of your choosing. Once I have confirmation they've arrived, you sign. Dante looked at Elena. Go, he said quietly. Do exactly what they say. Get in the car. Elena stood. Her hands were cut free by one of the perimeter men, who moved like he'd been waiting for the signal. She took Nico's hand. Nico stood up and looked at Dante with that expression again, the serious one, the one that was trying to understand everything happening. Then he said very quietly, so only Dante could hear it, Are you coming after? Dante crouched one more time. He put his hand on the side of his son's face, and he looked at those eyes, and he said the only thing that mattered, Yes, I promise. Nico held the look for a moment. Then he nodded. Once, grave and deliberate, a nod that accepted the promise and staked something on it, and turned to walk with his mother toward the door. Dante stood and watched them go. He kept watching until they were through the rolling door and into the gray morning light outside, and then he kept watching the open door for 3 more seconds after they'd disappeared, because the alternative was letting Raymond see anything on his face that wasn't already controlled, and what was on Dante's face right now, underneath the stillness, was not the expression of a man who intended to sign anything. He turned back to Raymond. The documents, he said. Raymond nodded toward an aide at the edge of the light, who approached with a leather portfolio. Dante took it. He opened it. He looked at the pages. Standard corporate transfer language wrapped around the machinery of criminal asset acquisition, legitimized through shell companies in 4 jurisdictions, requiring Dante's signature in 7 places. He held the portfolio. He looked at the pen the aide had extended. Raymond watched him with the patient confidence of a man at the end of a transaction he'd planned for 6 weeks. Dante looked up from the document. Before I sign, he said, I want to know one thing. Raymond tilted his head. Ask. Reese, your federal asset inside my organization. He watched Raymond's face carefully. Did he tell you about the meeting with Garrett? The tell was small. A fractional tightening at the corner of Raymond's eye, half a second of recalibration. But it was there, and it was enough, because the question itself was a test. Dante had deliberately framed it to imply he knew more than he might. And Raymond's reaction had confirmed something Garrett had not explicitly stated but which Dante had suspected. Raymond knew about Garrett's organization. He knew about the meeting in the parking structure. And he had moved on Elena and Nico not simply because Reese had burned, but because Raymond understood that Dante's meeting with Garrett changed the entire landscape of what was possible. Raymond had not moved early because he was rattled. He had moved early because he knew about Garrett, and Garrett's organization terrified him in a way that Dante alone did not, which meant the transaction Raymond was running right now, the signatures, the transfer, the clean ending, was not actually the objective. It was cover. The real objective was getting Dante into this building and contained before Dante could complete whatever arrangement Garrett's organization had proposed, because whatever Garrett's organization had proposed represented a threat to the Marchetti family that went far beyond losing one acquired syndicate. Dante closed the portfolio. He set the pen on top of it. He set both of them on the floor. Raymond's face changed. "What are you doing?" "I'm not signing," Dante said. The warehouse went very still. 6 visible men and whatever was in the dark adjusted their collective posture in the way that groups of armed men do when a situation pivots from transaction to confrontation. A subtle, unanimous tensing, a redirection of attention, the specific silence that precedes movement. Marco shifted his weight at Dante's left shoulder. Raymond looked at him with an expression that was moving through surprise towards something older and harder. "You just sent your family away," he said. "You have nothing to negotiate with." "I'm not negotiating." "Then what are you doing?" Dante reached into his jacket pocket. Not for a weapon. The movement was slow and visible and deliberate, because a fast movement in this room ended conversations permanently. He produced the folded document Garrett had given him in the parking structure. The personnel file. Reese's file. He held it up between 2 fingers. "I'm telling you what I know," he said. "And what I know is that Garrett's organization has a 14-month surveillance record of the Marchetti family's domestic operations, compiled in conjunction with the documentation your asset inside my organization provided to the federal case. And I'm telling you that I've agreed to provide Garrett with a full accounting of everything I know about your network in exchange for considerations that are no longer relevant to me personally." Raymond stared at him. "Which means," Dante continued, his voice level, "that the case that was pointed at me is now pointed at you. And the man who was supposed to prevent that, the asset you paid to keep inside my operation, is gone, burned, running, and everything he knew about both of us is already in a file somewhere that neither you nor I control." The silence in the warehouse had a different quality now. Not the silence before movement, the silence of calculation. "You're bluffing," Raymond said. But his voice had lost something. "Call Reese," Dante said. "Right now, call him and ask him if I'm bluffing." Raymond didn't move. Because Raymond couldn't call Reese. Raymond knew he couldn't call Reese, and Dante knowing that he knew was the entire point of the instruction. The absence of the call was the confirmation of everything. Somewhere outside the building, on the water side, Garrett had said, on the north end of the access road, there were people watching. There was a record being made. And Raymond Marchetti, who had built 44 years of his life on the architecture of his father's carefully maintained deniability, was standing in a warehouse with portable work lamps and 6 visible armed men and a document in someone else's hand that meant none of the architecture held anymore. He took one step forward, and behind Dante, the rolling door at the south entrance, the one Elena and Nico had walked through 8 minutes ago, opened again with the grinding metallic sound of something large being moved fast, and 2 men came through it, who were not Raymond's men, and were not Marco, and were not anyone Dante had planned for. And in the half-second it took Dante to process the new geometry of the room, Raymond's right hand moved toward his jacket, and the warehouse became the kind of place where things happened that could not be taken back. Marco moved first. He always moved first. It was the thing that had kept him alive and employed for 11 years. And the next 4 seconds were the loudest and most compressed that Dante Moretti had experienced in a decade. And when they were over, he was behind a stack of wooden pallets, with his shoulder pressed against Marco's back, and blood, not his, he was fairly certain it was not his, running down his left forearm from something that had caught him on the way down. and Raymond Marchetti was shouting something at his men in the language of a man whose plan has just left his hands entirely and who does not yet know whether what replaces it is survivable. Dante pressed his back against the pallet and breathed. He looked at his left arm. The cut was from a wooden edge, not a bullet, which meant his luck was holding in the narrow technical sense. He looked at Marco, who was bleeding from his lip and whose eyes were doing that particular rapid inventory of the room that meant he was hurt but functional and was currently deciding which problem to handle in what order. "How many?" Dante said. "Two through the door. Raymond's pulling back toward the north end." Marco's voice was low, controlled, a report rather than a conversation. "He's got 3 men still in position. The other 3 moved to the east wall." "The 2 through the door?" "Garrett's." I recognized the positioning. Dante absorbed this. Garrett's people, coming through the door Garrett had said they'd only observe from, which meant either Garrett had changed his assessment of the situation or the situation had changed in a way that altered Garrett's assessment. Either way, the board had rotated 45 degrees in the last 30 seconds, and the geometry of what was possible had shifted with it. He looked at the north end of the warehouse where Raymond had retreated, where the shadows were deeper and the work lamps didn't reach, and thought about the document in his jacket and the arrangement with Garrett and Elena's face when she said, "Come back," and Nico's face when he said, "Are you coming after?" and the nod that had staked something on the answer. He thought about the promise. Then he stood up. He stood up into a warehouse that had become a different place than the one he'd walked into. The work lamps were still running, throwing their flat industrial light across the concrete floor, but 2 of them had been knocked sideways in the scramble and now cast long diagonal shadows that made the space feel tilted, disoriented, like a room mid-collapse. The smell had changed too. Gunpowder layered over salt water and old timber, acrid and immediate. The smell that Dante had always associated with the moment after decisions become permanent. Garrett's 2 men were at the east wall, moving with the controlled economy of people who know exactly what they're doing and have done it enough times to stop looking like they're trying. 3 of Raymond's men were visible, 1 down near the pallets, not moving, 2 others who had retreated toward the north end where Raymond had gone. The remaining 3 from the east wall had vanished into the darker sections of the warehouse, which meant they were either repositioning or running, and Dante needed to know which before he moved. "Cover the east," he said to Marco, low and flat. "Don't engage unless they move on us." Marco nodded, already angled toward the darkness. Dante went north. He moved along the west wall, staying in the shadow margin between the lamplight and the corrugated metal, his left arm burning where the wooden edge had caught him, blood making his sleeve stick to his forearm in a way that was uncomfortable and irrelevant. He moved the way he'd moved through bad situations his entire adult life, not fast enough to be reckless, not slow enough to give someone time to set up ahead of him. The right speed, the speed that had kept him alive when being alive required active maintenance. He found Raymond at the far north end of the warehouse, near a service door that opened onto the pier. Raymond had made it almost all the way there. He was standing with his back to the door, one hand braced against the metal frame, and he was alone. His remaining men had either scattered or been engaged by Garrett's people, and he was breathing in the particular way of someone managing a level of adrenaline that their body wasn't accustomed to. Controlled planning and physical danger are different experiences, and Raymond Marchetti was a planner. He saw Dante coming and straightened. His hand moved toward his jacket again. "Don't," Dante said. The word carried the specific weight of someone who means it completely and has nothing left to lose by meaning it, and Raymond's hand stopped. They stood 10 feet apart in the cold north end of the warehouse, with the pier door behind Raymond and the rest of the building behind Dante, and the sound of the harbor water moving against the pilings underneath them, patient and indifferent, doing what water does regardless of what happens above it. Raymond looked at him. His face had shed the performance of ease. What was underneath it was older and less polished and more honest. A man who has just watched a plan he spent 6 weeks building come apart in less than 20 minutes, and is now running the arithmetic of what remains. "You've destroyed yourself," Raymond said. "You understand that. Whatever you think you've accomplished tonight, the organization is gone, the assets are frozen, the federal case is active. You have nothing." "I know," Dante said. Raymond blinked. He'd expected argument, defense, some version of the negotiation he'd been denied earlier. The agreement threw him. "I know I have nothing," Dante said. "That's not the same as having nothing to do." He reached into his jacket, the same slow, deliberate movement as before, visible and unthreatening, and produced the personnel file. He held it out. Raymond didn't take it. Reese was your asset, Dante said. 14 months. He gave you a map of my organization that you used to build a case you then offered to complicate in exchange for a transfer of everything I own. That's the structure of what you built. Gumtim that it's Chaskin. He paused. Here's what you didn't build for. Reese talked to the FBI. He also talked to you, which means the same information exists in two places, and the two places don't know about each other, and the information in each place points in both directions. At me and at you. Raymond's jaw tightened. That's not... Garrett's organization has been mapping the Marchetti network for 8 months. The documentation Reese provided to the federal case, the same documentation you thought was aimed exclusively at me, maps operational connections between my organization and yours that your father spent 40 years trying to keep invisible. Dante watched Raymond absorb this, watched the architecture of the man's certainty develop small structural cracks. When this building gets processed tonight, and it will get processed tonight, Garrett's people are already on it. What they find here, combined with what's in that surveillance file, combined with what Reese told both sides, is going to reach your father's name. The color in Raymond's face changed. Not dramatically. He had enough control for that, but perceptibly. A slight draining. The specific pallor of someone who has just understood that the thing they were most carefully protecting has been exposed. You can't prove... I don't have to prove anything, Dante said. I just have to provide what I know to the people Garrett works for, which is what I've already agreed to do. After that, what gets proved is someone else's job. Raymond looked at him for a long moment. The service door behind him was right there. The pier, the harbor. The possibility of not being in this building when it got processed. Dante could see him calculating it. Could see the specific mathematics of a man deciding whether running now accomplished anything or simply confirmed everything. Raymond didn't run. Instead, he said very quietly, "What do you want?" It was the first honest question he'd asked all night. Dante looked at him. He thought about what he wanted. He ran the inventory of it. Not the organizational answer, not the strategic answer, but the actual human answer, the one that had been building since a Tuesday morning and an envelope in 47 minutes at a duck pond. "My son," he said. "That's what I want. I want him to be able to grow up in a city where your family isn't looking at him as a mechanism. I want the case against me structured in a way that dissolves the organization without taking down every legitimate business and every non-criminal employee connected to it. And I want your father's name in the documentation because 40 years of careful deniability is not the same as 40 years of not being responsible." Raymond stared at him. "You're asking me to give you my father. I'm telling you what I'm giving Garrett regardless. What you do with the time between now and when that happens is your decision." A long silence. The harbor moved under the pilings. Somewhere in the body of the warehouse, there were voices. Controlled, professional, the sounds of Garrett's people doing what they'd come to do. Raymond looked at the floor, then up. His face had the expression of a man arriving at the end of something he'd been building toward his entire life, and finding that the arrival is nothing like the destination he'd imagined. "My father is 71 years old," he said. "I know. He has..." He stopped. Started again. "He's not well." Dante said nothing. He waited. Raymond pressed his lips together. He looked at the service door. He looked back at Dante. And then, with the particular heaviness of a man setting something down that he's been carrying for a very long time, he reached into his own jacket, slowly, visibly, mirroring Dante's earlier deliberateness, and produced a phone. He held it out. "The contacts on this phone," he said, "include every operational connection the Marchetti family has maintained for the last decade. Lawyers, officials, federal contacts, including Reese's handler. Every arrangement, every name, every number." His hand didn't shake, which was either composure or numbness, and Dante didn't know which. "That's what I can give you." Dante took the phone. "The door behind you," Dante said. "You've got maybe 4 minutes before Garrett's people reach this end of the building." Raymond looked at him. "You're letting me go." "I'm not doing anything. The door's been there the whole time." Raymond Marchetti looked at him for one more moment, something complex and unresolvable in his face. The look of a man who has just been shown something about the person they've been fighting that they didn't expect and don't have a category for. And then he turned and pushed through the service door and was gone, into the cold gray morning above the harbor. Dante stood alone at the north end of the warehouse and listened to the door bang shut and the water move and the professional voices growing closer, and he looked at the phone in his hand. Raymond's phone, with its decade of arrangements and names and numbers, and understood, standing there with his arm bleeding and his empire already past tense, that this was the moment he had been moving toward since a Tuesday morning, and that it felt nothing like he would have expected it to feel. It felt quiet, not empty. Not the flat gray nothing of penthouse mornings looking out at a city he controlled. Quiet in a different way. The quiet of something finished. He walked back through the warehouse to find Garrett. Garrett was standing near the center of the space, near the overturned work lamps, on a phone call he ended when he saw Dante coming. He looked at Dante's arm. "You need that looked at." Later, Dante held out Raymond's phone. Decade of Marchetti operational contacts. Names, arrangements, federal assets including Reese's handler. Garrett took it. He looked at it, then at Dante. "Raymond. Gone. Through the pier door." Garrett was quiet for a moment. "My people had the pier covered." "I know." Another moment. "You know I can't officially." "I know what you can and can't do officially. Raymond's phone is what I agreed to give you, plus what I know about the Marchetti network, the accounting we discussed." He paused. "The rest of it, I need handled a specific way." "Tell me." "The federal case against the Moretti organization. I'll cooperate fully. Documentation, testimony, whatever the structure requires. But the dissolution has to be clean for the non-criminal employees and the legitimate business holdings. There are people who worked for businesses I own who have no idea what funded those businesses. They don't lose their jobs because of what I did." Garrett looked at him steadily. "That's not a small ask." "I know, but the phone in your hand is not a small delivery." Garrett looked at the phone. He turned it over once. "I'll advocate for it. I can't guarantee a specific outcome." "Advocate hard." "I will." He put the phone in his coat pocket. He looked at Dante's arm again. "There's a medical contact 2 blocks from here. I'll have someone drive you. One more thing." Dante met his eyes. "Elena and Nico. Whatever footprint remains from my name, financial, operational, any connection that makes them a target for anyone holding a grudge against what I built, I need it gone. Clean separation, new documents if necessary, whatever your organization can do." Garrett looked at him for a long time. The evaluating look, the one that cataloged and measured. Then he said, "The boy's 6. "Yes." "He needs a father, not a clean separation." "He needs both," Dante said. "In that order." Garrett nodded once. "Done." Marco drove him to the medical contact. Dante sat in the back seat with his arm wrapped in a cloth Marco had produced from somewhere and watched the city move past the window. Morning commuters, coffee shops opening, the ordinary machinery of a day that had no idea what had happened in a waterfront warehouse an hour ago. He thought about Raymond's face at the service door, the look he hadn't had a category for. He thought about what it was, and after a few blocks he identified it. It was the look of someone who had expected to be destroyed and had instead been given a choice. Raymond Marchetti had been in this business long enough to understand that being given a choice, when destruction was available, was not a small thing. It didn't make them even. It didn't resolve anything between their families or their histories, but it was the thing Dante had chosen to do. And he understood, sitting in the back of Marco's car with his arm burning and the city moving, that the choosing of it was the first decision he'd made in 20 years that he didn't want to take back. The medical contact was a doctor who operated a legitimate practice and asked no questions about the origin of wounds, which was a professional courtesy that existed in most cities if you knew where to look. She cleaned and closed the cut on Dante's forearm with the brisk efficiency of someone who has made a decision about what she will and won't involve herself in and sticks to it. She told him it would scar. He said that was fine. He called Elena from the waiting room. She answered on the first ring. "I know you're okay," she said immediately. "Garrett's people called Marco, but I need to hear it." "I'm okay." He heard her exhale, a long, controlled release of something she'd been holding since he'd walked into that warehouse. "Nico's still asleep," she said. "He slept through the whole morning somehow. That's his superpower." A sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. "What happens now?" He looked at the waiting room wall. Generic art, the kind chosen specifically to be unremarkable. A lamp with a warm bulb, the ordinary furniture of waiting. I'm going to cooperate with a federal process that dismantles what I built. It'll take months. There'll be legal complications and financial ones, and some of it will be public. He paused. Your name stays out of it. Nico's name stays out of it. Garrett's people are handling that. And you? I'll be available for whatever the process requires. He chose the words carefully. And for whatever Nico requires. Every day. If you'll let me. A long silence. The lamp made its warm light on the ordinary wall. I meant what I said this morning, Elena said. Come back. I'm coming. I don't mean to the townhouse. Her voice had that quality again. The careful neutrality lowered, the personal register, the layer she only allowed in unguarded moments. I mean, come back, all the way. Whatever version of you exists after all of this, the real one, not the performance. That's the one I'm asking to come back. He sat with that for a moment. The weight of it and the specific nature of what it was offering. Not forgiveness granted in a single statement, not the erasure of 6 years or 3 years or any of it, but an opening. A door left ajar. I'll try, he said. Every day I'll try. That's all I asked, she said. That's all it ever needed to be. They stayed at Iris's townhouse for 11 more days, while Garrett's organization managed the initial phase of what it was managing, and Dante's attorneys, a different set than before, ones with no organizational connection, began the complex legal architecture of cooperation and dissolution. Dante slept on the couch. He did not ask for more than that and was not offered more than that, and it was the right arrangement for where they were. On the third day, Nico asked him to teach him to whistle properly. They sat on the townhouse steps in the autumn afternoon, cold enough to see their breath, warm enough to sit outside. And Dante demonstrated the technique with the patient repetition of someone who has nowhere else he needs to be, and Nico attempted it with total commitment and zero success for 40 minutes, and on the 41st attempt produced a sound that was recognizably a whistle, thin and wavering and triumphant, and threw both arms up like he'd scored a goal, and Dante laughed. A real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind he hadn't produced in long enough that the muscles involved had apparently forgotten the motion. And Nico looked at him with those eyes and said, I knew I was almost there. And Dante said, Yeah, buddy, you were almost there the whole time. Elena was watching from the doorway. She didn't say anything. She went back inside, but she was smiling. The dissolution took 8 months. It was not clean in the way clean was a word used for things without complications. There were depositions and asset freezes, and a morning on page 7 of the city newspaper with Dante's name in a headline that Iris cut out and threw away before Nico could see it. There were former associates who felt betrayed and former enemies who felt vindicated, and a long stretch of weeks where Dante's attorneys called with problems faster than solutions could be assembled. There were nights when Dante sat in the apartment he'd rented, small, 2 bedrooms, in a neighborhood that had no history with his name, and looked at the ordinary walls and felt the shape of everything he'd dismantled and tried to locate regret in the inventory. He found something, but it wasn't regret. It was closer to the aftermath of a fever, the exhaustion, the strange clarity, the altered relationship with the ordinary world that comes from having been somewhere else for a long time and returned. Marco found other work. He called once to say so, and didn't elaborate, and Dante understood that the call itself was the relationship being concluded with dignity, which was the right way to conclude it. Iris stayed in the townhouse and kept the refrigerator magnets. Dove recovered from the hit he'd taken at the door and sent a single text that said, okay, and nothing else, which was his entire vocabulary of reassurance. Garrett's organization delivered on the clean separation. Elena's name never appeared in any public documentation. Nico's name existed in no federal file anywhere. Garrett himself appeared once more, outside the coffee shop near Elena's new apartment in November, on a cold morning when Dante happened to be walking Nico to school. He fell into step beside Dante for half a block after Nico ran ahead to jump on a pile of leaves someone had raked to the curb. Raymond's father is being investigated, Garrett said, without preamble. The phone you gave me opened 17 parallel inquiries. I know. I read what I could. Raymond himself surfaced in Portugal. We're monitoring. That's your business now. Garrett was quiet for a moment. They walked half a step behind Nico, who was identifying additional leaf piles with the systematic enthusiasm of a scientist conducting field research. You did something unusual in that warehouse, Garrett said. Dante watched his son. I did several things. I mean with Raymond, the door. Garrett glanced at him. Most men in your position would not have made that choice. Most men in my position didn't have a reason to make a different one. Garrett seemed to consider this. They'd reached the end of the block. Nico had stopped at the corner, waiting the way Elena had taught him, not moving without an adult at street crossings, a rule he followed with the same seriousness he applied to everything that mattered. "The accounting you provided," Garrett said. "It was thorough, more thorough than our agreement required." "I know." "Why?" Dante looked at his son waiting at the corner, patient in the autumn morning, holding his backpack straps with both hands, the blue jacket he'd worn in the photograph that had started everything. He thought about the blank space in the crayon drawing on the school bulletin board. He thought about construction paper leaves and a stuffed animal named Gus, and 47 minutes at a duck pond that had cost him everything and given him the only thing that mattered. Because partial truths, Dante said, are how I built the thing I spent this year tearing down. I'm done with partial truths. Garrett looked at him for a moment, then he extended his hand. Dante shook it. Garrett walked back the way they'd come without another word, which was exactly his style. And Dante watched him go for a moment before crossing the street to where his son was waiting. The first birthday he attended was Nico's 7th. Elena organized it with the particular competence she brought to everything. A small party, at a park, 7 children, a cake that Nico had specified must be chocolate with blue frosting because blue remained superior to all other colors. Dante arrived early and helped carry the folding table from Elena's car and set up the plates and did not make it into a larger gesture than it was. Because it wasn't a larger gesture than it was. It was a man carrying a folding table to his son's birthday party. It was the smallest possible version of the thing it should have always been. Nico arrived with 2 friends from school and surveyed the setup with the critical eye of someone with strong opinions about his own party, declared it acceptable, and then pulled Dante toward the cake table to consult on the candle arrangement. 7 candles. He wanted them in a specific pattern that took 4 minutes to explain and approximately 1 minute to execute. Elena stood nearby, talking to another parent, and Dante was aware of her in the peripheral way. He was always aware of her now. Not the guarded awareness of 2 people navigating damage, but something that had started slowly and without announcement to resemble the earlier thing. The thing before the conference room and the gray dress and the pen with its soft click. Not identical to it. Something that had passed through fire and come out changed in shape, but not in its essential nature. She caught him looking. She didn't look away. He didn't look away either. Nico tugged his sleeve. "Dad, the candles." He turned back to the cake. "Right. Walk me through it again." "Okay, so the big one goes in the middle because it's the most important one, obviously. And then the 6 small ones go around it in a circle, like a crown." Nico looked at him. Exactly like a crown. He seemed genuinely pleased that Dante had understood this. "Did you think of that yourself? Just now?" "That's pretty good." High praise. He went back to directing the candle placement with the confidence of a person who has a vision and intends to see it realized. Dante placed the candles where he was told. Later, after the cake and the children and the blue frosting that got on everything, after the other parents had gathered their kids and the park had returned to its ordinary afternoon self, Elena and Dante sat on a bench while Nico ran circuits around the open grass in the inexplicable way of children burning off energy that appears to have no bottom. They didn't talk for a while. The silence was not uncomfortable. It had lost the particular tension of 2 people managing what they couldn't say and become something different. 2 people who had said most of the difficult things and were sitting with the aftermath. "He told his teacher he has a dad now," Elena said. Dante looked at her. "When?" "Last week. She mentioned it at pickup." She was watching Nico run. He said it matter-of-factly, like it was just a fact, like it had always been a fact. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that the moment hadn't already said better. "He doesn't know the details," Elena continued. "He knows you had a job that was complicated and that you don't do it anymore. He knows you made mistakes." She paused. "He knows you showed up. That's all he knows. That's the most important thing he knows." She turned to look at him. Her face in the afternoon light was the face he'd seen across a conference room table, across a park bench, across the kitchen table of a townhouse with refrigerator magnets, and it had never been the same face twice because life had moved through it and left its marks the way life does. And it was more honest for that, more real, more the actual face of the person he'd been too certain and too stupid to recognize as irreplaceable until he'd made her replaceable by force. "Dante, Basikiapo baswotorsa. Yeah. I'm not saying we're She stopped, chose the words. I'm saying the door isn't closed. That's all I'm saying. He looked at her. I know. Do you? I know what it cost to say it. I know what it took to get here. And I know... He stopped himself from filling the space with more words, because the instinct to fill silences with strategy and structure was a habit of the man he used to be. And the man he was now had learned, slowly and at considerable expense, that some silences are more honest than anything you can put inside them. He looked at his son running in the afternoon light. 7 years old, the age of a boy whose father had missed the first 6 years and was now sitting on a bench at his birthday party, having placed 7 candles in a crown formation on a chocolate cake with blue frosting. It was not a sufficient accounting for what was lost, but it was what was real. And real, he had come to understand, was the only currency that actually spent. Nico stopped running. He turned, chest heaving, and looked at both of them on the bench with the frank evaluating gaze he'd had since the duck pond. The gaze that looked at the world and drew its own conclusions without waiting to be told what to conclude. He looked at his father. He looked at his mother. He looked at the space between them on the bench. Then he ran back over full speed and sat between them without being invited, which was the only way he knew how to do anything. I'm tired, he announced. You've been running for 20 minutes, Elena said. I know. I'm very tired. He leaned against Dante's side with the unselfconscious weight of a child who has decided where he belongs and settled into it. Can we get ice cream? Dante looked at Elena over the top of Nico's head. She looked back at him. The corner of her mouth moved. Yeah, Dante said. He put his arm around his son. We can get ice cream. The afternoon held them there a moment longer. The park, the bench, the autumn light doing what autumn light does, which is make everything look like it's both ending and beginning at once. Then Nico scrambled up and announced that the ice cream place was in the direction he was already walking, and Elena stood and smoothed her jacket, and Dante stood beside her, and they walked after their son together into the ordinary, irreplaceable afternoon, carrying everything the past had cost them, and everything the present had returned, which was not the same as forgiveness and not the same as beginning again, but was something true and sustainable, and built on the only foundation that had ever actually held anything worth keeping. Not fear, not power, not the cold clarity of a man who controls everything. Just this. The boy ahead of them, running toward ice cream, turning back once to make sure they were still there. They were there. They were both still there. End.